The side gate of the Crane estate swung open, and I felt the air leave my lungs. A woman was walking down the aisle in a stitch-for-stitch replica of my bride's custom ivory gown. It wasn't just the dress. It was Sarah, the student I thought I'd buried 3 years ago. I could smell the heavy, cloying scent of the lilies on the altar. But all I tasted was copper. My best man leaned in, his breath hot against my ear, and whispered that the Board of Trustees was already calling security. I have exactly 12 minutes before the vows are exchanged and my tenure is revoked forever. But then I saw it. Tucked under Sarah's arm was a leather folder, and the handwriting on the cover belonged to Claire, the woman waiting for me at the altar. My wife and my mistress weren't enemies. They were talking. If I don't stop this ceremony in the next 60 seconds, I'm not just losing my job. I'm going to prison. Let me take you back to where this began. The scent of lilies and expensive cologne curdled in Robert's throat. Sunlight pierced the stained glass of the Crane estate's private chapel, splashing bruised purples and crimsons across the altar's white runner. He adjusted his silver cufflinks, the metal cold against his sweating wrists, and forced a smile for the sea of expectant faces. Beside him, Claire's hand trembled slightly, her lace veil a shimmering cloud of ivory. Robert's pulse thudded against his collar, a rhythmic reminder of the high stakes he played for today. This wedding was the final piece of a decade-long puzzle, the moment he would finally secure his place among the Montgomery elite and bury the ghost of his father's poverty forever. The heavy oak doors groaned open. A hush swept through the pews, sharp and sudden as a blade. Robert's heart skipped. Sarah Johnson stood in the threshold, framed by the blinding afternoon glare. She didn't scream or wave a weapon. She simply stepped onto the carpet. The hem of her silk gown, an exact mirror of Claire's bespoke Vera Wang, brushed the floor with a soft, rhythmic hiss. Every stitch, every bead, every delicate fold of the bodice matched. The visual disruption was absolute. A low murmur rippled from the front row where the university donors sat, their faces draining of color. Sarah's eyes locked onto his, wide and glassy, reflecting the flickering candlelight. She took another step forward, her shadow stretching long and dark toward the altar. Robert felt the air grow thick with the smell of guttering wax and the collective, suffocating shock of 100 people. Michael Davis, the university dean and Robert's best man, leaned in close. The frantic, rhythmic jingling of the 50 keys in Michael's pocket was a nervous staccato that only Robert could hear. Michael's face was a mask of strained composure, but his voice was a jagged whisper. He told Robert that the Board of Trustees, seated in the third row, were already leaning into each other, their eyes darting between the two identical brides. They were questioning Robert's professional integrity before the first vow was even spoken. The presence of a second bride wasn't just a scandal. It was a signal of chaos that the university's conservative board could not abide. Robert felt the walls of the chapel closing in, the weight of the limestone ceiling pressing down on his chest. His career, his tenure, and his future were all teetering on the edge of a knife. The tension snapped when a groundskeeper, a man named James Miller, who smelled of damp earth and gasoline, moved toward the side pews to intercept Sarah. Robert, consumed by a flash of white-hot rage, stepped down from the altar. He didn't think. He acted to preserve the image. He met James near the front row and shoved him forcefully back into the wood of a pew. The thud of the man's body against the oak echoed through the silent hall. Guests gasped, the sound like a collective intake of air before a scream. Robert's knuckles white, he stared the groundskeeper down, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to stop the interruption. He had to keep the machine moving. To the guests, it looked like a groom defending his sanctuary. But to the board, it looked like a man losing his grip on reality. Robert knew he had to contain the fire before it consumed the building. He signaled to his 4 ushers, sturdy men he had handpicked for their discretion. He gave them a sharp, silent nod, a command they understood perfectly. He watched with a sense of tactical coldness as they moved towards Sarah. This was the logical move. By physically boxing her into a mid-row seat, he could neutralize the visual threat. If she were seated, she became just another guest in a white dress, a strange but manageable anomaly. He felt a surge of confidence as the men surrounded her, their broad shoulders forming a human wall that forced her into the velvet-cushioned pew. As she sat, Robert's eyes caught a detail that made his breath hitch. Sarah wasn't empty-handed. Clutched against her bodice was a thick, leather-bound folder. It looked exactly like the university's official ethics charter, a document Robert knew by heart. But as he squinted against the candlelight, he saw the script on the cover. It wasn't the formal gold leaf of the institution. It was a delicate, looping handwriting he recognized from 1,000 grocery lists and anniversary cards. It was Claire's handwriting. A cold prickle danced across Robert's skin. Why would Sarah have a folder labeled by his bride? The relief he had felt seconds ago evaporated, replaced by a hollow, gnawing dread that sat in the pit of his stomach like lead. He turned back to Claire, but her face was obscured by the ivory lace, as still and unreadable as a marble statue. The ceremony concluded in a blur of forced smiles and hollow promises. As the wedding party moved toward the reception tent, the air outside was thick with the scent of damp grass and the approaching humidity of a New York summer. Robert found Sarah standing near the bar, her identical white dress glowing under the tent's fairy lights. He leaned in, his voice a low hiss, and offered her the London Fellowship, a position he'd spent months manipulating the budget to create. It was a king's ransom, a 6-figure stipend, a flat in Chelsea, and a guaranteed path to tenure. He watched her face, waiting for the spark of greed or the relief of a deal struck. Sarah said nothing. She didn't blink. She simply stared through him, her green eyes recording his sweat, his trembling hands, and the way he touched his breast pocket to count the $400 bills in his wallet. The silence stretched until it became a physical weight. Robert's hand shook as he reached for a glass of Merlot from a passing tray. The stem slipped. The deep red liquid bloomed across his pristine white silk vest like a fresh chest wound. He looked down at the stain, horrified. He was marked. The perfect groom was now a man covered in what looked like blood, standing before a woman who refused to acknowledge his existence. The humiliation deepened as the reception's technical systems began to fail. Robert stepped toward the mahogany podium to deliver his thank you speech, desperate to reclaim the narrative. As his hand brushed the metal of the microphone, a deafening, high-pitched screech tore through the air. It sounded like 1,000 fingernails dragging across a chalkboard. The guests winced, covering their ears. Robert backed away, the sound dying down. But every time he moved within 3 feet of the mic, the electronic shriek returned, jagged and violent. He looked at the sound technician, who was frantically flipping switches on the backup system. But the man just shook his head in confusion. Robert stood in the center of the tent, mouth open, silenced by his own equipment, while the board of trustees watched him with narrowing eyes. Seeking a moment of privacy to clean the wine from his vest, Robert retreated to the estate's lavish restroom. He pulled the heavy gold band from his finger, the Montgomery crest engraved in the metal, and set it on the marble vanity. He splashed cold water on his face, the scent of expensive soap doing little to calm his racing heart. He reached for a towel, wiped his eyes, and looked back at the vanity. The ring was gone. In the 30 seconds his eyes were closed, the vanity had been cleared. He spun around, checking the floor, the stalls, his own pockets. Nothing. The symbol of his union, his ticket to the Montgomery fortune, had vanished into thin air. He felt a wave of nausea. He was returning to the party as a marked, silenced, and now unwedded man, driven by a frantic need to find the ring or the thief. Robert pushed through the swinging double doors of the industrial kitchen. The heat hit him like a physical blow. 105 degrees of steam, grease, and the roar of exhaust fans. In the corner, near the prep tables, he saw a man with a camera strapped to his chest. The man wasn't taking photos of the food, he was filming the staff. "Give it back," Robert roared over the clatter of stainless steel. He lunged at the photographer, his fingers clawing for the camera strap. The struggle was brief and brutal. The man was younger, stronger, and moved with a calculated aggression. He grabbed Robert's lapels and slammed him backward. Robert's spine hit the edge of a heavy steel prep table, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. Silver platters of hors d'oeuvres slid to the floor with a rhythmic clang, 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 scattering smoked salmon and caviar across the wet tiles. The kitchen staff froze, their faces pale under the flickering fluorescent lights. Robert gasped for air, pinned against the cold metal, looking up into the cold, vengeful eyes of the man holding him down. The photographer leaned in, his breath smelling of peppermint and adrenaline. "My name is David Johnson," he whispered, the words cutting through the roar of the fans. "Sarah is my sister, and you're going to pay for every second our mother spent crying because of men like you." David's knuckles popped, a loud, sequential crack, 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 inches from Robert's ear. It was a warning siren, a sound of impending violence. With a final, contemptuous shove, David released him. Robert slumped against the table, his bespoke suit ruined, his chest bruised. Before Robert could call for security, David turned and vanished into the dark labyrinth of the estate's service corridors. Robert was left alone in the sweltering heat, the realization sinking in that this wasn't just a disgruntled student. This was a family vendetta, a coordinated strike designed to dismantle him piece by piece. He stumbled back into the cool night air, his mind racing. He looked toward the edge of the reception tent, seeking Claire, seeking some anchor in the storm. He saw her near the entrance to the rose garden. She wasn't alone. Sarah stood before her, the two identical white dresses shimmering in the moonlight, like twin ghosts. Robert froze behind a stone pillar. He watched as Claire reached into her beaded clutch and pulled out a small silver key. She placed it in Sarah's open palm. There was no shouting, no tears. Claire nodded once, a sharp, surgical movement, and Sarah tucked the key away. The betrayal was a physical blow to Robert's chest. His wife and his hunter were working together. The wedding wasn't a union, it was an execution, and he was the one on the block. The gravity of his situation became undeniable when the Board of Trustees intercepted him near the buffet. Richard Thompson, the board chairman, stood with a posture so rigid he looked like he was made of iron. He didn't look Robert in the eye. Instead, he adjusted his wool socks, ensuring the eagle pattern was visible. "The president has called an emergency session for 8 a.m., Richard said, his voice like gravel in a blender. "Your tenure is being reviewed for immediate revocation." The twin bride stunt was a mockery of this institution, Sterling. "And now we hear reports of a brawl in the kitchen?" Robert tried to stammer an explanation, pointing toward the garden, claiming Sarah was a stalker, a woman obsessed. But Richard simply turned his back, the message clear. Robert was already a ghost in the halls of the university. Desperate, Robert fled toward the darkened rose garden. He needed a weapon, a way to discredit Sarah before the morning sun rose. He saw a leather folder sitting on a stone bench near the topiary walls. He lunged for it, his fingers fumbling with the clasp. It wasn't the ethics charter. It was a draft of a thesis. Sarah's unfinished work on the architecture of institutional fraud, a plan formed in his mind, sharp and cold. He could use this. He would claim Sarah was mentally unstable, a student who had become so obsessed with his academic success that she had begun to hallucinate a relationship with him. He would show the board the obsessive notes, the stalker-like detail of her research into his life. He felt a surge of hope. This was logical. This was smart. He was a master of narrative, and he would rewrite her as a villain to save himself. He clutched the papers to his chest, his breathing slowing. He just had to find her, provoke a scene, and then present this evidence to the board as proof of her shattered psyche. He felt the familiar weight of his $444 in his pocket. 1, 2, 3, 4. The count was right. He was still in control. He saw a flash of white lace behind a high wall of manicured hedges. "Sarah," he barked, his voice echoing off the stone statues. He rounded the corner, finding her standing near a bed of white roses. "Give me the folder, Sarah. The real one. I know about the key. I know what you and Claire are doing." Sarah didn't move. She didn't speak. She just watched him with that recording lens gaze. Robert's composure, maintained through decades of academic posturing, finally snapped. He lunged at her, his hands reaching for the leather folder she held against her chest. They struggled in the shadows. The only sound, the rhythmic clicking of the automated sprinklers and the heavy thud of their feet on the mulch. Robert was larger, driven by a primal fear of ruin. He wrenched her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. Sarah fought back with a silent, desperate strength, but Robert's foot caught a decorative stone. As he tripped, he swung his arm to balance himself, his closed fist catching Sarah squarely across the jaw. The sound of the impact was sickening. A dull thud, followed by the sharp crack of her head hitting a wooden trellis. She crumpled, falling backward into a thicket of thorny rose bushes. Robert stood over her, chest heaving, the smell of crushed flower petals and iron-rich blood filling his nose. He reached down and snatched the leather folder from her limp fingers. "I told you," he hissed, his voice trembling. "I told you I wouldn't let you ruin me." He looked down at her, pinned among the thorns, her white dress beginning to stain with red. He had the folder. He had the thesis. He had won. "Is that what you think happened, Robert?" The voice came from the shadows behind a statue of Minerva. Claire stepped into the moonlight, her face a mask of cold fury. Beside her stood the university president, his eyes wide with horror. Claire was holding her smartphone aloft, the screen glowing with the playback of the last 60 seconds. She had recorded the entire assault, the lunging, the struggle, and the deliberate strike that sent Sarah into the thorns. Robert's hand went to the folder, his mind frantically trying to pivot to the stalker defense. "She attacked me. I found her thesis. She's obsessed." "Open the folder, Robert," the president said, his voice flat and dead. Robert tore the leather cover open. It wasn't a thesis. There were no academic papers inside. Instead, he found a stack of bank statements, offshore wire transfers, and internal ledgers from the Montgomery family charity. His own signature was on every page, authorizing the diversion of millions of dollars into accounts he used to cover his gambling debts at the high-stakes tables in Atlantic City. The thesis, he thought he'd found, was a decoy, a trap designed to make him commit a violent act in front of witnesses while holding the very evidence of his crimes. The world tilted. The smell of the roses became the smell of a funeral. The end came with the rhythmic wail, wail, wail of sirens approaching the estate gates. Robert sat on the stone bench, the leather folder heavy on his lap. He watched as the university president walked toward the flashing blue and red lights to meet the police. Claire didn't look at him again. She walked to the rose bushes and helped Sarah up, the two of them moving toward the house without a backward glance. Robert was left in the dark, a man who had spent his life counting to 4 to keep the world in order, only to realize he had been subtracted from the equation entirely. In a small, windowless study in the back of the mansion, Richard Thompson sat across from Robert. A single lamp cast long, jagged shadows across the walls. "We aren't going to arrest you tonight," Richard said, reading from a document in a monotone voice. "The university cannot afford the scandal of an embezzlement trial. You will sign this resignation. You will sign over your interest in the Montgomery estate. And you will leave this state by dawn. If you ever set foot on a campus again, we release the footage of the garden." Robert looked at the man's eagle-patterned socks. He knew he could fight. He knew the board had their own skeletons, their own tax evasions he'd stumbled upon over the years. He opened his mouth to negotiate, to threaten, to use the last of his leverage. But as he looked at the cold, empty eyes of his former colleagues, he realized he was tired. The count was 0. He signed the papers. As he walked toward the gates, a shadow detached itself from the stone wall. Sarah Johnson stood there, no longer in the white dress, but in a simple trench coat. She held a digital recorder in her hand. 4:12 a.m., she whispered. "The record is complete." "Why?" Robert asked, his voice a ghost of itself. Was the affair just a way to get the keys? Sarah looked at him, and for the first time, he saw the person behind the lens. "There was no affair, Robert. I'm an investigative journalist. But more importantly, I'm the daughter of Professor Elias Thorne. Do you remember him? The man you framed for plagiarism 20 years ago to take his seat on the department chair? He died in a state hospital, broke and forgotten." She stepped closer. "I didn't destroy you because I loved you. I destroyed you because the truth finally caught up to your shadow." At dawn, Robert Sterling sat on a grime-streaked bench at the Port Authority bus station. The air smelled of stale cigarettes and sour beer. He opened a discarded newspaper. The headline didn't mention him. It celebrated the launch of the Claire Montgomery Foundation for Institutional Ethics, with a photo of Claire and Sarah standing side by side. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He counted the bills. 4 hundreds, 2 20s, 4 1s. Exactly $444, his shield against the world. He looked at the money, then at the delayed sign on the departure board. He realized the numbers didn't mean anything. He was a man with the exact change for a life he no longer owned. As the bus hissed to a stop, Robert Sterling stepped into the exhaust fumes and disappeared into the gray morning fog.